Greetings, my name is Mweni Wambua and welcome to the Grief Cafe. At the Grief Cafe, we'll be having conversations on all matters grief. Grief is a complex conversation, and yet it's a very necessary conversation because it is a regular thing. It is actually a life experience. Whether you have experienced loss, whether you're going through loss right now, or you will be going through loss in future. So the best thing to do is prepare for it. Let's talk about it. Let's unmask it. Let's demystify it. And let us realize that once we begin to get comfortable with the discomfort of the conversations around grief, then we'll be able to navigate our grief better. But I ran ahead of myself. Who am I and what do? I do three things in this life. I am an authenticity coach, I am a grief therapist, and I am a pastor. What does that all mean? It means that I help people navigate the changes and challenges of life in a manner that is true to who they are, in a manner that protects their dignity, and in a manner that reconnects them back to God. Because what happens is sometimes when we go through loss, it leaves us wondering, is God still a factor in my life? And so I'm hoping that through the grief conversations at the Grief Cafe, you will be able to get clarity on some of these complex issues. And so the best place to start is, what is grief? Many times when we think about grief, we only put it in a little corner and make grief seem like it is only about death of a person. But did you know that there are at least 42 things that impact the human heart and cause us grief? Many things that we think are just the normalcy of the everydayness of life actually causes grief. A simple one for many of us that we can relate to is when you lose your phone, or even if you have left the house and the phone is at home. There's always that sense of what's going on. Is this the day that I will get that phone call that I was waiting for? And that emotion, that anxiety, that questioning, all those emotions that you go through, that actually leads us to what the definition of grief is. Because grief is simply defined as the conflicting and confusing emotions that arise as a result of loss. Another definition of grief is the end of a pattern of life as we have known it. Now, when you begin to think of grief in terms of those two definitions, you begin to realize that there is grief all around us in so many ways and in such a wide manner. When I was training as a grief therapist, one of the things that my trainer told us, and it made sense, he said, we need to realize that we exist in a world that has all manner of grief. In fact, he said, the world we live in is a grieving world. There are different types of grief. There are different ways we grieve. There are different things that influence how we grieve. There are different factors that shape how we grieve. There are different ways that we express our grief. And many times we tend to think that when a person has gone through a loss of any kind, the only way that they can grieve, and it becomes clear to us that they are grieving, is when they cry. But did you know that grief affects us in different dimensions? Grief affects the way we think. Grief affects the way we feel. Grief affects the way we behave. Grief affects our bodies, our physical bodies feel the impact of grief. And grief affects our spiritual connection. Our spiritual relationship with the divine is affected by grief. And finally, because grief affects us in these 5 key dimensions, it therefore means it affects how we relate with the people around us. Because think about it in case of a family that has gone through a loss. Maybe they've lost their home. Maybe they've had a burglary experience. Or maybe they've lost a loved one. Or they've had a diagnosis that is terminal. Each individual member of that family has been impacted in these 5 dimensions. And therefore, As they interact with each other, they're interacting, having been impacted on these 5 dimensions individually. And therefore, grief now begins to affect how they interact with one another, because my thinking has been interrupted, the other person's thinking has been interrupted, and so the thinking in that homestead has been shifted. My physical health has been impacted by the loss. The behavior of this other person has been impacted. And so you begin to see that in their interaction with one another, their grief gets amplified. And that is why when people are grieving, many times it is possible to find that you have little disagreements, big fights, and sometimes they can become really, really big issues. And that's normal. And that's the one thing that I'm hoping that as we continue with these conversations, we will begin to realize that grief is the normal and natural reaction to loss. So even those disagreements, even the tempers rising, even some people withdrawing, it is all part of the grief journey. By itself, grief is actually not a disease, but left unprocessed, it can deteriorate and become something else and cause complexities in other places. However, even though it is not a disease, grief has a natural progression. Think about it. When we first have the news, when we first receive the news of a grief incident, we have all sorts of reactions. Some people even faint. You know, you've been told that your house has been damaged by the floods. Your loved one has passed on. Your car, the tree where you parked your car under has fallen on the car. You have been transferred to work in another county, in another city. Your children, many of us, we don't think about it. But what happens when children need to move, when we think it's time to move children from one school to another? Many times we will not even ask for permission. You know, we just think, I am mom, I am dad, I make the rules, and so I'm transferring you because it is for your own well-being. But did you know that those children have relationships in that school? Did you know that those children have a way that they have learned to operate in that school, and therefore moving them from one school to another causes them grief? Another way we grieve is death of a pet. Many times we tend to think pets are just these animals that we keep at home. But when you think about the attachment that we develop with our pets, when pets die, a family member actually dies. And so we grieve when a pet dies. We live in a country that has had demolitions of homes. Did you know that homes are not just about brick and mortar? Homes are investments, not just financial investments, but they are emotional investments. You'll probably go to the bedroom where you would mark, this is the height of child 1, this is the height of child 2, and you're marking their growth progress. And now, child 1 and 2 are even in their 40s, but those markings remain on the wall. That's the emotional investment in that home. You will sit in the sitting room and all the memories shared over different conversations will come back to you. You will sit in the dining room and it will come back to you, all the meals shared around that table, all the people that have sat around that table. You even know who sits where in a family. And so when a home is demolished, it's not just a loss of brick and mortar. Yes, there's a financial investment, but there's so much more. Other losses that we go through is changing jobs. You know, in your first job, you knew how to operate. You knew who to call when you need help. You knew who to talk to when you need a day off. You even knew who parks where. You even know how casual is Casual Friday. You know, some people, Casual Friday, some organizational cultures, Casual Friday simply means do not come to work with a tie. For other people, it means that's the day to wear your pink trousers if you're a man. For ladies, it may mean all sorts of outfits that you can wear on that day. And then you move to another organization and their corporate culture is completely different. And then even though the choice to move from one organization to another was conscious, intentional, and sometimes even very, very forcefully coming from us. We're looking for a new job. We're looking for new opportunities. We're looking for greener pastures. But then when you move to this new job, when you finally land that new job that offers you everything that you have been looking for, you get there and you begin to realize, I miss my old job. Because there were things that were familiar there. You had learned how to operate there. And so in this new place, you begin to miss your old job. And so allow me to suggest this. Many times we will not think about it, but we can't grieve even when things that we perceive to be good happen to us. Personal incident, I really liked Mombasa. I really like Mombasa. I love the sun. And you know, when you think about how cold Nairobi has been, I always think, oh my goodness, if I was in Mombasa, if I was living in Mombasa, I would not have to endure this cold. But I had a chat recently with a friend of mine that works for a bank, and she was working in Nairobi, and she was transferred to Mombasa. And I remember just telling her, tell me, how are you enjoying the sun in Mombasa? I mean, Nairobi is so cold. And she said, that's my biggest struggle. Because the heat in Mombasa, the sun never goes off. It is hot all day, every day, 24/7. And so you begin to, and I thought, that's very interesting, because I thought I would want to work in such a place. But she says, previously, and truth be told, before she went to Mombasa, she did look forward to the change of weather. But previously, her previous experiences with Mombasa had only been 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 days on holiday, and then you're back in Nairobi. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 days of basking at the beach, sitting at the pool at the hotel, and not really experiencing the being in the office 8 to 5 and a hot day and having the fun all day long. She had never experienced that. And so going to Mombasa and now going into the corporate culture in the Mombasa environment, as a Nairobian, first of all, one of the things she had to do was change her wardrobe. Because her wardrobe in Nairobi consisted of jackets and all those things that keep us warm, but it was not working there. And so that experience of letting go of one season, letting go of a pattern of life as you have known it, and changing into a new pattern and beginning to understand, beginning to get used to the idea of a new pattern, beginning to relearn how to navigate this new season, that place and the emotions that arise there is actually grief. I will, in the link below, you will find, in the comments below, you will find a list of all those things that can cause us grief. One of the things that when I was learning how to become a therapist that caused grief, and we never really think about it, is when a politician loses their seat. Many times we think they deserved it. Many times we think it doesn't matter because I don't even like that politician. But let me tell you, think about it. Think about it. One seat can have up to 10 candidates. Multiply that with the number of seats in the country, and you begin to see that out of each seat, which can only be occupied by one person at any given election, there are 9 people that are grieving. What are they grieving? Think about the emotional investment of running a campaign. Think about the financial investment of running a campaign. Think about all the social capital that it takes to run a campaign. Every time you're having a conversation with your family, it's always about the campaign. They even no longer see you as a brother, as sister, they just see you as the candidate. And so there's a high that you're on, and then you lose, and then you begin to come down from that. That's grief. Think about someone who was diagnosed with a terminal disease, and they begin to see their own life, their own body being ravaged by the illness. They begin to have concerns. They begin to think about the daughter they will not walk down the aisle. They begin to think about the son who is growing up without a father. They begin to think about the wife, the mother, or even the husband that will have to parent alone, or even the sibling that is going to leave his family. We have all these relationships, and we begin to see the person and the impact of their terminal disease. And some diseases, even though they're terminal, we begin to learn how to manage and live with them. So you may get a diagnosis and you're told to learn to live with this disease, you change your diet, you change your lifestyle, you lose weight, you stop eating this, you start eating that. That emotion that comes around that place, that is grief. And so let's talk about the reality of grief. And so 5 things about the reality of grief. Number 1, grief is a journey. And like every other journey, we need to know what the destination looks like. What does that mean? Now, when I talk about grief recovery, it can be a bit confusing because we think, I had a cold last week and I recovered and nothing about me has changed. I am well. So recovery seems to imply that you go back to the former ways. You go back as though nothing had changed. And so when we talk about grief, isn't that a fallacy? Because I have gone through an experience where some things have permanently changed, irreparably changed. So how can we talk about recovery over such changes? Here is the thing. Like every journey, we know the destination. Even when we've had a permanent and irreversible change, there is still a need to think about what my destination looks like. This is what I say about the recovery journey. Think of this hand as the grief moment and the place you are when you start grieving, and this other hand as the place of recovery. And so we are moving from this side to this side. This side is where the grief is heavy, and this side is where we will say you have recovered from the loss. And the side of grief being heavy and intense, the grief here, when you think about this place, the emotions are heavy, the grief is heavy, and the memory of whatever it is that you have lost is a place of pain and anguish. But here, in the place of recovery, this place, the memory of that which you have lost has evolved. It has evolved to become a place of gratitude, a place of truth, and a place of love. The journey of recovery is the journey in between. And this journey in between differs from one person to another. And the dynamics of the journey in between is very individual. Because even though we may be family members and we have lost the same person or place or thing, our journeys are very individual because we do not grieve titles, we grieve relationships. And so the journey here can take very different dimensions for every individual. But once you know where you're going, then you begin to make steps there. Because remember, in every journey, direction remains more important than speed. So number 1, grief is a journey. Number 2, grief is personal. No one else is feeling what you're feeling. No one else can actually feel what you're feeling on your behalf. No one else is going through the experience that you're going through. Yes, there may be people around you that have lost homes. There may be people around you that have lost mothers, but this is you. It is personal. It is mine. So that's a reality of grief. Another reality, a third reality, is that grief is unique. What does that mean? It means that every individual goes through their grief experience in a manner that is very unique to them. Sometimes one of the things that we tend to think is, I lost my brother and now I lose another brother, and therefore the experience is going to be the same because it is me who lost a brother and this is another brother. But did you know that in the loss of the first brother, there was a different relationship? In the loss of the second brother, there's a different relationship. They maybe lost them in different circumstances. Maybe there's so many different dynamics at play and variables that will determine how you grieve this brother and how you grieve the next brother. The relationship and the title of the loss is the same. You've lost a brother, but the experience is unique. Number 4, grief is intense. Let's not lie. Grief is intense. And the intensity of grief is compounded by the fact that the emotions are both confusing and conflicting. Confusing emotions are emotions that are many emotions showing up at the same time. And conflicting emotions is emotions that feel like they cannot sit at the same place at the same time. Let me give you an example. Confusing emotions is if you walk to a supermarket and you're looking to buy cooking oil. And if you look at the aisle that has cooking oil, there is a whole array of cooking oil. And truth be told, apart from the high-end ones and sometimes the one the array here at eye level is usually the same. They look like the same. The difference is not very much. And even price-wise, the difference is not much. So the difference, I'll buy oil X and not oil Y, may not be because of money. But so if you send someone and say, go and buy for me cooking oil, they will stand there and they'll be confused because there are so many different varieties to pick from. It is the same way with emotions. Sometimes we feel so many emotions and all at once. And that can be very confusing. So that is why when you ask somebody who's going through their grief season and you ask them, how are you feeling? And they say, I don't know. It's a truthful answer because they're angry, they're depressed, they're feeling abandoned, they're feeling rejected, they're feeling overwhelmed, they're feeling this, they're feeling that, they're feeling that, they're feeling all these things. And when you're going through grief, the emotions are so many and the emotions are so intense and everything is so loud. In the conflicting emotions are those emotions that make you feel like one negates the other, or at least it should. Think about someone whose relationship has come to an end. You are probably married and you are in an abusive relationship. And then that relationship ends. The natural response for the rest of us who are outside looking observers, we would think, you must be happy now. But you know, it is normal to have conflicting emotions at that place. I am happy I am no longer being abused, but I am now anxious because, oh my goodness, I'm going to have to raise the children alone. Think about when you have been nursing a sick one, a loved one who has been unwell for a period of time, and then they pass on. There is a sense of relief because if you're a person of faith, you will think they have rested from their pain. They are no longer in pain. But then on the other hand, you ask, am I saying I'm happy that they are gone? And so these two emotions seem like they are conflicting. These two emotions feel like they are negating one another. But you know, the amazing thing about the human being and the human heart is that we can have what our hearts can hold, controversies. And so these two emotions can sit together. They're not in competition, neither do they have to negate each other. We can hold both of them and feel them and lean in on them fully. The fifth reality of grief is that grief is transformative. Friends, There will always be a version of you before the loss and after the loss. There will be a different person that comes out on the other side after the fire. When you go through the fire, the person that got into the fire and the person that gets into the other side has been changed by the fire. What can be burnt has been burnt, and what gets to the other side is a bit more refined. Sometimes when we go through loss, some of the things that were very, very relevant and very, very big issues on this side, when you get to the other side, it doesn't matter anymore. And so grief does transform us. But you know, we can also choose how to be transformed. It can either leave us bitter and angry, or we can begin to see the growth and the seasoning that comes to our life with grief. Do not get me wrong. I have not said that you will no longer cry when you have been transformed. You will remember. You will feel the pain, because here is a reality of grief. Grief is not a work we do and then move on. No, grief becomes an everyday living with the memory and the awareness that my life has been touched by loss. And so friends, that's our conversation today. I wonder, when you look at the list below, what loss you can identify with and where you are in your journey. Are you making progress in that journey? Remember, direction in your journey of grief is more important than speed. It may seem like you're making one step, but you know what? One step in your journey in a year and every day you just do one step, that still remains 365 steps in the direction that you're going to. And so, tuendelee kuongea. May the Lord bless you.